Fraser. Thank you for coming on Spectator TV. Now, obviously, much of the news has been dominated this week by Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages. The Telegraph's got hold of thousands of them from during the pandemic. And they said there's 2.3 million words, enough for the King James Bible. You spent the past couple of weeks in the Telegraph office going through these messages, sifting through them. What struck you the most reading them?
The funny thing is that to me, the biggest story is one that you can't actually put in the front page of a paper. I mean, there are lots of jaw-dropping moments, but when you see them all, as I have done, look at these thousands of messages, then what jumps out at you first of all is what's not there. Like, you'd think if you're going to tell children to put on masks, there would be some kind of evidence, and the evidence isn't there the whole time. And then secondly, it's the kind of nervous system that you see. This is a political nervous system. We're all very worried that so-and-so is doing, that Nicola Sturgeon's doing this, maybe we better catch up with her. And then Chris Whitty has said, look, Chris, is there any scientific evidence to this? He'll say, well, maybe not, it doesn't really matter, it's not worth the fight. But Chris Whitty saying it's not worth the fight isn't a scientific judgment, it's a political judgment coming from a scientist. So we now see, when we were all told that we're following the science, just the form that took. So you get to see, not so much in the big stories, but more of the smaller day-to-day conversations, the role these scientists had. They were mute quite a lot of the time. They were saying stuff. They were allowing themselves to be used in a way, for example, that Anders Tegnell in Sweden, who led his response, would never allow himself to be used. So this was very much a political response to the pandemic, with science being invoked as political cover, and scientists as well being invoked for political cover.
Would you go so far as to say that the public have been misled about this? Like you say, they've been told throughout the pandemic that a lot of decisions have been made for scientific reasons, and now it seems like the opposite.
Well, certainly there are occasions where they lied and where the public were out and out misled. When children were told to wear masks in corridors, for example, Gavin Williamson appeared on TV saying, we always listen to the best scientific and medical advice. Now we've now got the message thread at exactly that stage, and it wasn't anything to do with science or medicine, it was about to do with politics. Now, of course, that's more misleading than outright lying. Gavin Williamson, we also know, was fighting for the children to learn unimpeded from masks and was fighting to keep the schools open, and for that he was attacked and mocked fairly mercilessly by the WhatsApp thread. And that's the other thing that I noticed, that what WhatsApp gives you, in a way that no other document dump could, is a psychological profile of how this group of men who had untrammeled power went from being fairly open-minded about lockdown within a few weeks to thinking, okay, this is what we want to do. And then it got sectarian. The sort of language you're more used to finding on Twitter, you can now see is used by government ministers. So they start to see themselves as heroes. That's a word they use quite a lot. They debate who's the biggest hero. And they are anti-virus. And anybody who opposes them, even within the cabinet, so Rishi Sunak, Alok Sharma, Theodore Agnew, and the Lords, they're regarded basically as being in the service of the virus, and people who don't want to stop the virus. So that's an incredibly pejorative way of talking about somebody. Of course, Rishi Sunak wanted to stop the virus, but he was trying to talk about a balance of risks. So you end up with this mentality. I think to me that's what jumps out a lot, that the government was being run, first of all, by WhatsApp groups. That was never an appropriate forum. But they had, in the way that all WhatsApp groups do, they take on their own sort of psychology. And this psychology was lockdown being seen as a political campaign. And the enemies of the world capital of their enemies was Sweden, of course. And there was lots of chat. Any stories suggest Sweden's in problems, they get shared quite gleefully on the thread. Matt Hancock talks. He says, "All right, I want you to give me some evidence about why Sweden doesn't work." Rather than say, actually, Sweden's fought back 2 waves without lockdown. How do they manage it? What can we learn? It's a sectarian sort of political mindset. Now, the language of politics is different to the language of science. The language of science invites refutation. I've come up with a theory, it may not be right, so let's test it. Only if it's empirically tested will I believe it to be true. So you're quite humble with a theory. You start, you wait for the tests. The language of politics and the method of politics are very different. This is what I believe. I'm going to disparage and destabilize my opponents. I'm going to call them names. I'm going to rough them up. And this pandemic was fought using the language and the methods of politics when it pretended to be using the language and method of science.
And you mentioned there that one of the most interesting parts of seeing these messages is the fact that we're almost in the room as these decisions were being made. We're seeing what people were thinking, though in a very odd way. Did you find the messages from Boris Johnson quite interesting, and sort of seeing the way that he was sometimes pushing back against his advisors? Did you think that maybe we could have ended up with a different policy if things had been done in a different way?
He blows hot and cold in the messages, Boris Johnson. Now, there's no doubt that the biggest challenges to lockdown do come from him. He sort of pops up now and again to say, hang on a minute, are we really sure we want to do this? Normally you feed him an opinion poll and he goes away, right? Because public opinion played a major part in this. I mean, of course it shouldn't do. You should be thinking about how to get through a pandemic with fewer life lost. But you were thinking, okay, we don't want to go too far ahead of public opinion. So Boris Johnson emerges as somebody who is trying to think for himself. You get the impression that he's uncomfortable with his gung-ho mentality of the advisors. But when he goes off the thread, then you see them talking about him like he's a problem to be managed rather than a leader to be followed.
And I think, so during the pandemic, I think political leaders were given a lot of space to make mistakes, and that a lot of people recognised that they were facing an unprecedented virus that they didn't know a lot about. So there was a lot of forgiveness. It might have been shambolic at times, but they thought, we'll give them a chance because it's difficult. Do you think these messages are going to shift that view, and that people are going to be a bit less forgiving of the way they handled lockdown?
Well, I think you need to separate what things were like at the very beginning, when nobody knew anything. We had this pandemic hurtling towards us. There were credible threats that 250,000 people could be dead. So at that stage, of course, the only option open to anybody in government was to make very difficult, very big decisions, a lot of which were going to be wrong. There was simply no way that anybody in any country was going to avoid that. But you tolerate these emergency powers on the condition that you learn from these mistakes, that you will correct. You'll think, okay, we've got no evidence now, but by the end of April, you had lots of evidence. You see how the pandemic was working. You saw how Sweden had turned about with that lockdown. You've got a lot more to go on. You would expect, therefore, error correction to take in. But what this didn't factor in was that the political mind is such that you don't really like admitting to mistakes. You get entrenched. And in a way, the bigger the call you make, the more you're likely to defend it. For example, let's take the decision to invade Iraq on the basis that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Now we know, in the months that followed, it emerged that no such weapons were found because they didn't exist. So even then, Tony Blair found it very difficult to accept that he had launched a war on a false premise. That's not because Blair is a wicked man, because of the cognitive bias which affects all humans, politicians especially so. So in a way, you could argue that any 12 people plunged into that situation, given absolute power and no transparency, not answerable to the cabinet, let alone parliament, let alone the public, would have acted in that way. But the big question here is not to litigate the past. I'm personally not very interested in what Matt Hancock said or what he didn't say. What matters is how to make sure when the next pandemic comes along, as there will be a new pathogen fairly soon, that we've got an apparatus in place and we have learnt the lessons. But how are we supposed to learn any lesson if we can't discuss what went wrong? Because all of this is in the hands of an inquiry, an official inquiry, whose remit seems to be to kick this into the long grass and to make sure no politician has to answer anything until the general election or afterwards.
A lot of the Spectator's coverage during the pandemic was critical or asked whether the downsides of lockdown were being considered enough when they were being introduced, for example, the economic impacts, the social impacts and so on. Do you think that view is going to be vindicated by the messages that yet to come out and that you've seen as well?
Well, what I try to do as editor, what we all did in The Spectator, was to make sure that we didn't define public interest as being a government's megaphone or amplifier. We gave space to all sorts of views, including scientists very critical of what the government was doing. We ran articles and people very much supported what the government was doing. We gave a mixed view. I was just amazed as editor to find out how controversial it was to give a mixed view. How often I'd be called up by people saying, look, you can't give space to Dr. John Lee, he's crazy. You can't give space to Snitra Gupta. This isn't an Oxford epidemiologist, but there was an idea that you were somehow letting the side down if you were even questioning what this Tory government was doing. Now, I am quite prepared to believe a lockdown might be judged the right thing to do. But what I also firmly believe is that the only way we can do this is by an open and free debate, not by one which is edited by politicians or censored through the prism of an inquiry. So my bias, my agenda all the time has been towards journalism and journalistic inquiry. That's what The Spectator's been doing for 200 years and what we'll be doing, God willing, for the next 200.
Thank you, Fraser.